Padre Pio, born Francesco Forgione in 1887, was not merely an Italian Capuchin friar known for his stigmata and mystical gifts. For many, he was a direct channel between heaven and earth, a man whose life seemed to transcend the limits of time and matter. Amid his prayers, sufferings, and miracles, there are accounts of visions and messages he reportedly received about the future of humanity, about wars, about the church, and, according to some contemporary scholars and mystics, about a leader who would arise in the final times, a president, a man who, though surrounded by political and social controversies, would be connected to a spiritual mission beyond the limits of human understanding. The idea that Padre Pio might have prophesied about a last president may sound absurd at first glance. After all, he lived in a time when the United States was only an emerging power, and the world was still healing from the wounds of the First World War. Yet it is precisely in this context that his visions gained strength. Padre Pio was known for his ability of bilocation, for reading souls, and for predicting events with uncanny accuracy. There are records of letters and testimonies suggesting that he spoke of a great spiritual battle to come, an invisible war between heavenly and infernal forces, fought not only in the hearts of men, but also on the world's political stage. According to some accounts preserved by the faithful and scholars, Padre Pio allegedly mentioned, in moments of spiritual ecstasy, that a man would come from the west clothed in power, yet surrounded by shadows. He would not be understood nor accepted by the wise, but he would be an instrument of the divine will. This phrase, though shrouded in mystery, has been interpreted by many as a direct reference to a political leader of the United States. And here, the figure of Donald Trump enters the narrative, not as a conventional politician, but as a prophetic character, surrounded by symbolism and events that seem to echo the saint's words. From the moment of his rise to the presidency, Trump became the target of fierce criticism, yet also the object of an almost religious devotion among certain Christian and conservative groups. His firm stance against abortion, his defense of religious freedom, and his relationship with Israel were viewed by many as signs of a spiritual mission. And although he himself never claimed to be a divine envoy, some see in his trajectory a kind of prophetic fulfillment. The notion of him as the last president does not necessarily refer to the literal end of the American presidency, but to the end of an era, a transition between the world as we know it and a new spiritual reality. In his visions, Padre Pio spoke of times of purification, of a great darkness that would cover the world, and of the need for leaders who would serve as instruments of light, even if imperfect. He said that God chooses the small to confound the great, and that truth would come by unexpected paths. These statements, drawn from his writings and testimonies, have been reinterpreted in light of current events. Political polarization, technological advancement, and the moral and spiritual crisis afflicting the world all seem to converge toward a breaking point. And at that point, the figure of the last president takes on meaning. This is not about political idolatry, but about a spiritual reading of the signs of the times. Padre Pio did not name Trump, nor could he, but his words seem to sketch an archetype that fits precisely with the former president, a controversial man, rejected by many, yet who, according to this interpretation, is fulfilling a prophetic role. And if this is true, what does it mean for the future of humanity? Are we standing at the threshold of a greater revelation, of an event that will redefine history? That question is the starting point of a journey that crosses the mysteries of faith, the backstage of politics, and the secrets preserved by saints and visionaries. Padre Pio was no ordinary man, and his words should not be dismissed as mere metaphors. They carry the weight of a soul who suffered, who saw the invisible, and who left clues for those with eyes to see. And perhaps, by looking at the present through the eyes of spirit, we may understand that history is about to change, not by human will, but by divine design. The invisible signs in the spiritual war. Understanding Padre Pio's prophecies requires more than a literal reading. It demands diving into symbolism, spiritual language, and the hidden lines that reveal deeper truths. Padre Pio was not a political prophet, but a man of prayer who received visions and messages during states of deep ecstasy. Many of these revelations were recorded by his confessors, disciples, and close followers. Although not all of them have been officially recognized by the Church, they have circulated for decades as part of a mystical legacy that continues to intrigue theologians and scholars. Among these revelations, one stands out: the vision of a battle between light and darkness, fought not only in the heavens but also within human structures, governments, institutions, and especially world leadership. Padre Pio is said to have declared in one of his visions that the world will be governed by those who do not understand the world, but who are used by greater forces. This seemingly enigmatic statement has been interpreted as a reference to the spiritual manipulation taking place behind the scenes of global politics. It is not simply about human conspiracies, but a true spiritual war, where angels and demons influence decisions, hearts, and destinies. And it is within this context that the figure of the last president takes on deeper meaning. He would not merely be a head of state, but a catalyst, a breaking point between the old world and the new era that is coming. Throughout his presidency, Donald Trump was a target of relentless attacks from the media and political and social sectors alike. Yet at the same time, he was surrounded by religious leaders, pastors, rabbis, and priests who saw him as an instrument of God. He was anointed in public ceremonies, prayed over by Christian leaders, and frequently linked to biblical passages describing imperfect kings used by God to accomplish greater purposes. The comparison to Cyrus, the Persian king who freed the Jews, was often made by evangelical leaders, and this was no accident. It reflected a spiritual perception that went beyond conventional politics. In his visions, Padre Pio spoke of times when the chosen would be persecuted and the righteous would be slandered. He also said that the devil would infiltrate the highest structures, and only the eyes of faith could discern the truth. When applied to the modern world, these words seem to perfectly describe the environment of polarization, censorship, and manipulation dominating global society today. Truth has been relativized, faith ridiculed, and Christian values attacked in the name of new morality. And in the midst of this landscape emerges a leader who, despite his human flaws, stands against the tide, defending principles many still consider sacred. The idea that Trump might be the last president does not necessarily mean he will be the last to hold office, but that his presidency marks the end of an era of illusions, of manipulations, of hidden domination by forces working in the shadows. Padre Pio is said to have declared that the world will be shaken and the foundations of the earth will be laid bare. Some interpreters believe this shaking has already begun. The pandemic, international conflicts, economic crises, and moral decay are seen as signs that something greater is unfolding. And Trump, with his disruptive stance, is viewed as the trigger that set this process into motion. There are also reports that Padre Pio had visions of America, though he never named it directly. He spoke of a distant land powerful but wounded within. He said that from there would come a man who would cause division, but who would also open the eyes of the blind. This description, though symbolic, seems to fit Trump, a leader who divided public opinion like few others in modern history, yet who also awakened millions to spiritual, political, and cultural issues that had long been dormant. His impact was not only political, but cultural and spiritual. The spiritual war Padre Pio described was not a metaphor. For him, it was an invisible yet concrete reality. He declared that the demons are more active than ever, and the angels weep for mankind. He urged constant prayer, devotion to the rosary, and confession as weapons in this war. Today, many who follow his spiritual path believe we are living in the very times he described. The battle is not merely between parties, ideologies, or nations, but between good and evil, between light and darkness. And the last president would be the one who, whether aware of it or not, stands at the very center of this battle. Trump, with his strong personality, controversial decisions, and resistance to the system, represents a sign for many, a sign that the time is being fulfilled, that prophecies are manifesting, and that history is about to be redefined. Padre Pio, through his life of suffering, prayer, and revelation, left clues for those who dare to see beyond the veil. And perhaps, by connecting these dots, we may realize that the world is in transition, not merely political, but spiritual, and that each of us must choose which side we will stand on when the truth is finally revealed. Prophetic echoes in the invisible thread of revelation. The history of Christian spirituality is filled with voices that, across different eras, announce events that seemed impossible but, over time, reveal themselves as pieces of divine puzzle. Padre Pio was not the only one to speak of times of purification, unexpected leaders, and a spiritual battle that would involve the entire world. Other saints, mystics, and visionaries also left messages which, when considered together, form an invisible thread that seems to point to a decisive moment in human history, a moment many believe is happening now. Saint Faustina Kowalska, for example, had visions of divine mercy and of a time when the world would be called to repentance before a great judgment. She spoke of a light that would come from the east, but be reflected in the west, and of a time when leaders would be instruments even without knowing it. These words, though symbolic, echo Padre Pio's messages, who also spoke of leaders being used by God to fulfill greater purposes, even if they were rejected or misunderstood. The idea that political power can be a channel for divine action is not new, but it gains strength when we observe the parallels between these revelations. Another example is Father Stefano Gobbi, founder of the Marian priest movement, who reported receiving interior locutions from a Virgin Mary. In his writings, there are messages about a great apostasy within the church, about a painful purification, and about a man who would rise amid chaos, bringing order but also division. This description, once again, aligns with the image of a leader who is not understood by most, yet fulfills a prophetic role. Gobbi spoke of the United States as a turning point in the spiritual history of the world, and how decisions made there would have global repercussions. When compared to Padre Pio's visions, these messages reveal a spiritual convergence that cannot be ignored. It is not coincidence but prophetic pattern that spans decades and continents. The figure of the last president emerges as an archetype, not merely an individual, but a symbol of transition, rupture, and revelation. Donald Trump, with his unusual trajectory, resistance to the system, and connection to religious leaders, seems to embody this archetype in a remarkable way. Padre Pio spoke of times when men would forget God, and God would allow them to be shaken. He said that truth would be persecuted, and the messengers slandered. These words resonate strongly in today's context, where faith is marginalized, morality is relativized, and Christian values are attacked in the name of a new order. In this environment, leaders, even flawed, become instruments of spiritual resistance. Trump, by taking a stand against abortion, defending religious freedom, and supporting Israel, touched on issues considered sacred by many Christians. This did not go unnoticed by those who study the prophecies. There are also revelations from contemporary mystics speaking of a last chance for humanity, a time of choice and decision. They say that heaven is in motion and the signs are being given. In his visions, Padre Pio spoke of 3 days of darkness and of a time when men would cry for light, but would not find it. These apocalyptic images should not be interpreted with fear, but with discernment. They point to a profound change, a moment when the truth will be revealed, and each person will have to choose their side. In this context, the last president is not merely a politician. He is a sign, a landmark, a turning point. His presence on the global stage, surrounded by controversies, attacks, and almost religious devotion, indicates that something greater is unfolding. Padre Pio, through his life of suffering and prayer, left messages that are only now beginning to be understood. He said, God writes straight with crooked lines, and that the chosen would be recognized only by the humble. These statements, applied to the present, reveal that truth is not where the world points, but where the Spirit discerns. The connection between the prophecies of different saints and mystics shows that we are living in a prophetic time, a time when the veil is being lifted and the signs are manifesting. Padre Pio, Saint Faustina, Father Gobbi, and many others spoke of this era. And now, before the eyes of the world, we see events unfolding. The presidency of Trump, with all its highs and lows, seems to have been the trigger for this revelation. And if he truly is the last president, this does not mean the end of politics, but the beginning of a new era, a spiritual era of discernment and truth. History is being written before us, and the signs are everywhere. Padre Pio taught us to see with the eyes of faith, discern with the heart, and trust that God is in control, even when everything seems lost. And perhaps, by connecting these messages, we can understand that the time of revelation has arrived, and that the last president is only the beginning of something much greater, something that will redefine history, not by human force, but by divine will. The invisible throne and the backstage of the mission. The presidency of a country like the United States is, by definition, a position of political power. But when observed through a spiritual lens, it can become something much deeper, an invisible throne where celestial and infernal forces contend for influence over the destiny of humanity. Padre Pio, in his visions, did not speak directly about presidents or governmental systems, but about times when leaders would be tested like never before and their decisions would carry eternal weight. This phrase, recorded by one of his confessors, reveals a hidden dimension of leadership, that earthly power can be used as an instrument of heaven or of hell. During Donald Trump's tenure, many decisions were made that, at first glance, seemed purely strategic or ideological. But upon deeper analysis, some of them directly touched on spiritual and prophetic matters. The relocation of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem, for example, was seen by many as a fulfillment of biblical prophecies. Jerusalem, a sacred city for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, is the spiritual epicenter of the world. By officially recognizing its centrality, Trump did not merely make a political gesture. He activated a series of prophetic interpretations pointing toward the end times. Padre Pio said, "The heart of the world beats in Jerusalem, and when men touch that heart, heaven will respond." This phrase, though poetic, gains concrete meaning when we observe the events that followed Trump's decision. Conflict intensified, alliances broke, and global attention turned to the Middle East. For prophecy scholars, this movement was not coincidental. It was a sign, a landmark, a turning point indicating that we are approaching a time of revelation. Another important aspect was Trump's stance on religious freedom. In an increasingly secularized world, where expressions of faith are ridiculed or censored, he positioned himself as a defender of spirituality. He welcomed religious leaders to the White House, participated in public prayer events, and signed decrees protecting the right to religious expression. For many, this was just political strategy. But for those who observe with the eyes of faith, it was a prophetic gesture. Padre Pio said, "When men pray in public, the angels will sing in silence." He believed that collective prayer had the power to transform realities, and that leaders who encourage it will become instruments of light. Behind the scenes of the presidency, there are reports of secret meetings with spiritual leaders, counsel received during moments of crisis, and decisions made after reflection and prayer. Trump, although not seen as a traditionally religious man, surrounded himself with figures carrying deep spiritual insight. Pastors who speak of prophecies, rabbis who interpret signs, and priests who see in the trajectory the fulfillment of celestial messages. This environment, invisible to most, reveals that a spiritual battle is being waged, not only in the streets, but in the corridors of power. Padre Pio spoke of times when men will be called to choose between comfort and truth. He said, "The truth will be hard but liberating." And this is exactly what we see today. Trump's presidency, with all its controversies, exposed truths that had been hidden. It revealed corruption in systems, manipulation of information, and the fragility of structures sustaining the modern world. By doing so, it provoked a spiritual reaction. Millions began seeking answers, questioning narratives, and returning to faith. The idea that he would be the last president does not mean there will be none after him, but that his presidency marks the end of an era of illusion, silent control, and spiritual domination disguised as progress. Padre Pio said, "The devil dresses in modernity and seduces with empty promises." Today, we see how technology, culture, and politics have been used to distance humanity from God. But we also witness a reaction, a spiritual awakening happening worldwide, driven by events that, at first glance, seem merely political. Behind the presidency, there are also signs that cannot be ignored. Dreams, visions, messages received by intercessors claiming that Trump is fulfilling a spiritual mission. Some speak of divine protection, of spiritual attacks he faced, and of moments when he was sustained by invisible forces. Padre Pio said, "The chosen do not know they are chosen, but they feel the weight of the mission." And perhaps, by observing Trump's trajectory, we can perceive this weight, not as a political burden, but as a spiritual responsibility. The presidency, in this context, becomes a battlefield. Every decision, speech, and gesture has repercussions beyond the visible world. Padre Pio taught that The spiritual world is more real than the physical world, and everything that happens here is a reflection of what happens there. This vision, though mystical, is shared by many spiritual leaders who see today's politics as a mirror of the war between light and darkness. And Trump, with his firm stance, became a symbol of that resistance. If he is indeed the last president, it means we are witnessing the end of the cycle, a cycle of deception, manipulation, and distancing from God, and that his mission, even if not understood by all, is to serve as a catalyst for a new era, a time of revelation, purification, and return to truth. Padre Pio, with his simple yet profound words, left clues for this time. And now, by connecting the dots, we see that history is being written with spiritual ink. The invisible throne of the presidency is, in fact, an altar where humanity's destiny is being decided, the signs from heaven and the time of decision. There are moments in history when events seem to align so precisely that it is impossible to ignore the feeling that something greater is unfolding. Padre Pio, in his visions, spoke of a time when heaven would speak through signs, and men would have to choose whether to listen or ignore. This phrase, recorded by one of his disciples, has been used by scholars to interpret global events that have unfolded over the past decades, especially during and after Donald Trump's presidency. The idea that we are living in the time of prophecy is not merely a mystical belief, but a spiritual reading of the signs manifesting in every sphere of human life. During Trump's tenure, the world witnessed a series of events that, for many, were not only political or social but spiritual. The global pandemic, for example, was seen by various religious leaders as a call to repentance, a forced pause that compelled humanity to look inward. Padre Pio said, God allows suffering to awaken sleeping hearts. And that is precisely what happened. Churches closed, services moved online, families gathered in prayer, and a desperate search for answers that science could not provide. This spiritual awakening, although silent, was one of the greatest in recent times, and many believe it was catalyzed by a sequence of events that began with Trump's presidency. Another sign that drew attention was the increase in extreme natural phenomena, devastating fires, earthquakes in previously stable regions, unusual storms, and even signs in the sky, such as eclipses and planetary alignments coinciding with prophetic dates. Padre Pio spoke of the earth groaning under the weight of sin and heaven responding with visible signs. He believed that nature reflected humanity's spiritual condition and that when men turn away from God, creation would react. Today, we see this reaction on a global scale, as if the planet itself were crying out for redemption. During this period, there was also a significant increase in prophetic dreams, visions, and messages received by ordinary people, not just mystics or religious figures. Accounts of spiritual encounters, celestial messages, and supernatural experiences multiplied, especially among those devoted to prayer and fasting. Padre Pio said, in the end times, the small will hear what the great ignore. And that is exactly what is happening. Ordinary people without theological training are receiving revelations confirming the messages left by saints and prophets. Many of these revelations point to a time of decision, a time when each soul will be called to choose between light and darkness. In this context, Trump continues to be seen by many as a sign, not a savior, but a prophetic marker. His presence on the world stage, even after leaving office, continues to provoke intense reactions. He is loved by some, hated by others, but ignored by none. Padre Pio said, God's instruments cause division because the truth separates the wheat from the chaff. Trump, with his firm stance and controversial decisions, has been precisely that, a watershed moment. He exposed systems, revealed hidden intentions, and provoked a polarization that, though painful, is necessary for truth to come to light. Heavenly signs also manifest in events that, at first glance, seem disconnected. The intensification of religious conflicts, the increase in persecution of Christians around the world, and attempts to silence voices speaking about faith and morality are all indicators that we are living in a prophetic time. Padre Pio said, when the truth is persecuted, the time of revelation is near. Today, we see how truth is being attacked, not only in churches, but in schools, the media, and even in families. The deconstruction of Christian values is a reality, and the resistance to this deconstruction has become a spiritual mission. In this scenario, the idea that Trump will be the last president gains even more weight, not because he will be the last to hold the office, but because his presidency marked the beginning of a new era, a time of revelation, spiritual confrontation, and preparation for what is to come. Padre Pio spoke of a time when men would be called to fight, not with weapons, but with prayer. Today, we see how prayer has become the primary weapon of those resisting darkness. Movements of intercession, spiritual vigils, and campaigns of fasting and prayer have multiplied, as if the world were preparing for an invisible battle. The signs are everywhere, and for those with eyes to see, they are clear. Padre Pio left messages that, though shrouded in mystery, point to this time. He said, "Heaven does not shout, but whispers to those who listen." Today, the whispers from heaven are becoming more audible, more urgent, more intense. History is being written with spiritual ink, and every event, every decision, every gesture carries eternal weight. The time of prophecy has arrived, and the choice lies before each of us. The church in crisis and the call to truth. Padre Pio was always a fervent defender of the church, even when it faced internal turmoil. He understood that the institution, though divine in its origin, was composed of flawed humans, subject to temptation and error. In his letters and confessions, he warned of times where the smoke of Satan would enter the temple of the Lord, a phrase later echoed by other religious leaders, including Pope Paul VI. This image of smoke, subtle, invasive, hard to detect, represents the infiltration of ideas, practices, and influences that distort the truth of the gospel and weaken the church's spiritual mission. And today, many believe we are living in exactly that time. Throughout the 20th century, the church underwent reforms, councils, and changes that, while necessary in many respects, also opened the door to ambiguous interpretations and a flexibility of principles once considered non-negotiable. Padre Pio, though obedient to ecclesiastical authorities, faced internal persecution, was forbidden from celebrating public masses, and had his gifts questioned by members of the hierarchy itself. He endured all with humility, but made clear that a spiritual battle was taking place within the church. And according to many scholars, this battle has reached its peak in recent decades. The crisis of faith, moral scandals, the politicization of religious discourse, and attempts to adapt doctrine to the demands of the modern world are signs that the church is being tested. Padre Pio said, "Truth does not need to be adapted, it needs to be lived." Today, we see how that truth is being relativized, reinterpreted, and in many cases silenced. The church's mission has always been to be a light amid darkness, but when that light begins to waver, the faithful feel lost. It is in this context that leaders who, even outside the ecclesiastical structure, become instruments of God to awaken humanity's spiritual consciousness. Donald Trump, although not religious in traditional sense, was seen by many as a defender of faith. He opposed abortion, defended religious freedom, and was supported by Christian leaders who viewed his stance as resistance to the advance of an anti-Christian culture. Padre Pio said, "God can use even those who do not know him to fulfill his plans." This phrase, provocative as it may be, reveals a profound truth. Divine action is not limited to the walls of the church. And when the church itself falters, God raises voices outside it to remind the world of what has been forgotten. During Trump's presidency, there was an unprecedented rapprochement between political power and religious leaders. Pastors, priests, and rabbis attended official events, prayed at the White House, and publicly declared that they saw Trump as an instrument of God. This alliance, though criticized by many, was interpreted by others as a prophetic sign. Padre Pio spoke of a time when prophets would be found in the deserts, not in the palaces. Perhaps, looking at the current scenario, we can understand that spiritual deserts are being filled by voices without ecclesiastical titles, but carrying the flame of truth. At this moment, the church faces a dilemma: remain faithful to doctrine or adapt to the demands of the world. Padre Pio always defended fidelity, even when it meant suffering. He said, "The cross is the way and there is no other." Today, many religious leaders avoid the cross, preferring easier, more popular, more acceptable paths. But the truth of the gospel has never been comfortable. It has always been radical, demanding, transformative. And when the church strays from this truth, it loses its spiritual strength. In this scenario, the prophetic mission revealed by Padre Pio becomes even more relevant. He warned not only of external dangers, but also of internal ones. He said, "The enemies of faith are not only outside, but also within." Today, we see how ideologies contrary to the gospel have infiltrated religious discourse, how distorted spiritual practices have been normalized, and how the search for social approval has replaced the pursuit of holiness. The church is in crisis, and this crisis is spiritual. In this context, the figure of the last president becomes even more symbolic. He represents a rupture, a resistance, a reminder that truth cannot be negotiated. Padre Pio said, "When men forget the truth, God will remind them through the unlikely." Trump, with his firm stance and rejection of political correctness, became one of these unlikely figures. He is not a saint, a theologian, or a pastor, yet his presence sparked a spiritual awakening that, in many cases, the church itself failed to provoke. The prophetic mission revealed by Padre Pio is not only about future events, but about present choices. He called us to prayer, penance, and fidelity. And today, more than ever, these choices are urgent. The church must return to its essence. The faithful must rediscover the strength of faith, and the world must hear the voice of truth once again. Perhaps, by observing the signs, the events, and the figures emerging on the global stage, we can understand that God is acting, not as we expect, but as we need. The final call and the choice that redefines history. The spiritual journey we have traveled so far, guided by the visions of Padre Pio and the events that marked Donald Trump's presidency, is not merely a mystical narrative. It is a call, an invitation to reflection, action, and decision. Padre Pio was not a political prophet, but a man who lived intensely the pain and the light of faith. His words, often shrouded in mystery, carry an urgency that is only now beginning to be understood. He spoke of a time when men would be confronted with the truth, and there would be no escape. That time, according to many scholars and mystics, is now. The idea that Trump represents the last president is not limited to politics. It transcends the office, the term, the system. It points to the end of a spiritual cycle, to the closure of an era marked by deception, manipulation, and distance from God. Padre Pio said, "The world will be purified by the fire of truth." And that fire has already begun to burn. It manifests in crises, revelations, and divisions, but also in the search for meaning, in the hunger for spirituality, in the thirst for justice growing in previously dormant hearts. History is being reshaped before our eyes, not by decrees, not by laws, but by spiritual choices that each individual is being called to make. Padre Pio taught that the greatest battle is fought in the silence of the soul. Today, millions face that battle, between fear and faith, between doubt and hope, between comfortable lies and painful truth. Trump's presidency, with all its highs and lows, reflected that battle. It exposed what was hidden, provoked intense reactions, and awakened consciences that had been anesthetized. But the focus is not on Trump. It is on us. Padre Pio said, "God does not need great men, but available hearts." That is what this time demands. Availability, courage, discernment. Prophecy is not a fixed script, but an invitation to transformation. Each of us is part of this story. The church, governments, families, individuals, everyone is being called to choose, not between parties, but between principles, not between ideologies, but between eternal truths. The last president is a symbol, a milestone, a sign that the time of neutrality is over. Padre Pio said, "He who does not choose is already chosen." Today, the choice stands before us. Light is manifesting, but so are the shadows. And the battle will not be won by human strength, but by faith, by prayer, by repentance, by a return to essence. History will be redefined not by those who govern, but by those who surrender to the divine will. In this prophetic time, every gesture matters. Every word carries weight. Every silence has meaning. Padre Pio taught that heaven is closer than we think, and hell too. This proximity demands vigilance. It demands surrender. It demands that we stop being spectators and become protagonists of faith. The mission is not only to resist, but to illuminate. Not only to denounce, but to heal. Not only to wait, but to act. The prophecy that can redefine history is not written in secret books, but in the hearts that choose to live the truth. Padre Pio was one of those hearts. And today, we are called to follow in his steps, to carry the cross, to face darkness with the light of prayer, to transform the world, not with speeches, but with holiness. History is in our hands, and the time is now.